live. Okay, hello, welcome again to another Ask the Expert session. Today with the topic ZK Spring versus ZK Springboot. There has been some confusion in the past, which one is better or which one should be used, and I'll try to separate these two items or how they can be used in combination, because they are two isolated topics. So this session is to clarify the difference between the two packages we have. Now my name is Robert, as always. I think you know me. I'm a ZK consultant and support engineer since roughly 6 years here in Taipei. And I will talk today, as said, about ZK Spring, ZK Springboot. Again, just to remind you, if you want the recording after the session, don't send me your email address in the chat. That usually gets ignored. Just reply to your invitation email, and then we know who you are and who wants the recording. And then we send you a link where you can download the recorded session and the source code project, and also the chat, as I said, with some comments from my side. All right, then let's start. So ZK, well, let me just drink a tea. ZK Spring, ZK Springboot. So what are these two topics, or what are these two packages? And in fact, there are 5 packages. So there are 5 different Maven modules that we have that are related to Spring and Springboot. Just to start with a simple one, here we have zkplus, which is quite an old, or not old, one of the original libraries in ZK that has some integration code for various libraries like CDI, Spring, JSP support. I think there is some old Hibernate util and stuff that has been complicated in the past. I don't think everything is completely useful of this one right now nowadays, but for backwards compatibility we keep this, and from time to time we move outdated elements into zkplus legacy. So there's another module that that contains code that you don't need by default. For example, we moved the old data binding into zkplus legacy. It's still there, it's just deprecated, but there are lots of older projects that still use it, so they shouldn't break when they use it. So here's the popular and legacy integrations are in this project, and one of them is the Spring variable resolver and a Spring util class. Yeah, how do I start? So basically, yeah, the purpose of this library is you can enable it or you can include it, and it doesn't require any configuration automatically in your ZK application. It doesn't add any Spring configuration. It's something optional you can use on demand, and this one already offers the lowest level of Spring integration. You have a variable resolver, which is a common concept in ZK to extend the expression language or to extend the via variable annotation to resolve Spring beans by name. And also the Spring util is just another utility class to get a Spring bean directly from your current Spring context. We will see what this does in a second. I'll just try to introduce the other layers we have. We have the ZK Spring Maven dependency, which is split into 2 modules, which is Spring Core and Spring Security. Both of them don't do very much anymore, but if you need it, they might be helpful to get some, as you see, it adds some custom scopes, like the ZK web application scope, the desktop scope, and the execution scope. Spring already has some default scopes, like also application scope and session scope and request scope. And because ZK has different lifetimes for the web app and the desktop and the execution, they are added on top. For example, desktop is the scope that lives as long as the browser tab is open. So multiple requests to the same desktop will see the same Spring beans. I'll also have an example about this. And the execution scope is ZK's abstraction around the request and response cycle, but it also covers the WebSocket requests, for example, which are not a default request scope because they're not a servlet request. So, and also if you have server push background threads, they also have to activate an execution at some point, and then you have access to execution scoped Spring beans if you use this feature. And it has a core variable resolver which is added automatically. That's why it says it adds some Spring config by default. So it registers these scopes. No, you register these scopes on demand, but it adds this core variable resolver, which adds another variable by default, which is just the Spring context variable. So if you somewhere need in your expressions, if you somewhere need the Spring context, you can refer to directly like this, instead of saying web application context utils get default web application context or something. There is a Spring util that does this, and this one exposes this Spring context in your as an expression variable. So inside, don't know the right word. It adds this variable next to your other desktop variables or parameters objects. So it's one more implicit object in ZK. And then there's the Spring Security package, which also adds some configuration. So as soon as you add these dependencies, you will have additional automatic config happening, and it will register a tag library for role and access control list checks. You have another variable resolver which adds the authentication variable, which can contain the current user if you're using Spring Security, and it has a security context aware execution listener. Sounds terrible, but that's what it does. It makes background threads aware of the Spring Security context, even if they don't go through the filter chain of Spring Security. Yes, and Spring Boot I will cover in a minute, because this one is mostly about configuration, and Spring Boot is about deployment and automatic configuration. So this is a different topic, and you can use both together. But these two, Spring Core, Spring Security, and of course zkplus, can be used in any traditional WAR file deployment. And let's just look into one or the example that we already have in our on our website, in our documentation. I just copied this into this demo project here and updated it to the latest version, just to show that everything works with the latest version. Just check the dependencies for a second. So this is our POM file. It's quite large here in this case. But what we do is we include the latest version of Spring and the latest version of Spring Security. That's somehow a tradition of Spring that the numbers don't match here. I just picked the latest ones, assuming they are correct. And so far in my test case, in my test, they worked. What else we have here is we integrate, we use Spring Core and Spring Security, so these two packages, just to get the automatic namespace, to get the namespace configuration for the Spring scopes, to get the taglib functions for security checks, and the stuff I just mentioned before. And otherwise, we just use default Spring, zkbind, zhtml, just for various reasons, just for various examples, and zkplus for the delegating variable resolver, and some Spring MVC for the Spring MVC configuration. We will see a bit how this works, but it's nothing special. In ZK, Spring MVC is Spring MVC. There are just a few URLs in a ZK application that makes sense to configure via Spring MVC, or in especially that can be used for the Spring Security, for the web security configuration, special paths. And what else did we add? The that's one of our forum users pointed out that these dependencies need to be added, the ACL and the security config and security config web. Otherwise, our project fail to build. So when you copy the example, it works. But if you try this yourself, you have to add these to get the functionality of the ZK Spring security package. We didn't add them automatically as transitive dependencies to avoid including the wrong version, because very often versions change, maybe there are vulnerabilities, and there shouldn't be any version conflict based on our layer on top of ZK Spring, not on top of Spring Security, because you can use Spring Security without the ZK layer on top. So that's why you pick your own version. And if you want to use ZK Spring Security, you have to add these dependencies in your version deliberately so that the features work. We have an open feature request to improve the error handling to give you a better error message when, in case you forget to do this, to add these. And then default servlet API. Something new I just discovered today. Since Java 9, the Java X annotation API is no longer included by default in the JDK, so it needs to be added deliberately to have the post construct and the pre-destroy annotations that are heavily used in Spring, or often used in Spring Bean configuration. And then some testing, JUnit, and of course I use Jetty to run this. Yeah. What do we then? We have, of course, a standard web application with the web XML. We do all the Spring listeners. We say we have a context loader listener to start the Spring context when the application starts up. And we have this annotation config web application context. I forgot what this one is about. Something we also need. And the context config location. Right. The context config location is there because I use Java config instead of a configuration file. So by default, you will often see that there is an application context file in the webinf folder. In this case, I use Java config just because some people think it's more modern than the XML config, but still both exist. I think both are similarly old. I think XML and Java config have been there since Spring 3 or something. It's just become more popular to use Java config, and that's our starting point of the application. And the request context listener is to register the default Spring scopes, like the web application scopes for request in session context. And then this is our own internal dispatcher servlet. Is this still needed? Does this exist? No, okay, just, I don't remember why we have this here. I need to figure out, I just didn't look into this file before the training. And mapping HTML, Big Bang servlet name, could be that this is no longer needed. I need to find out. And our ZK configuration only has some debug config, timeout config, and some access denied exception for Spring Security. More interesting is the configuration itself. We have application config, which will just configure our Spring beans. So we have one simple bean, which is a singleton scope bean, and we have one ZK specific desktop scope bean, just to demonstrate the two different things. And what I do also is I import or I add the custom ZK scopes. Now this is the Spring's, the ZK scopes configurer, and which one is just registering all the scopes. What I would say is don't use page scope, don't use ID space scope. They're just here for backwards compatibility, but I haven't seen them used in practice, and they have been removed, or not removed, they have been deprecated. and they don't really make sense anymore because the features that use these have been removed already from ZK Spring. Because also I've never seen them used, and they were difficult to port into the latest Spring version. So we decided to just upgrade ZK Spring first. And if there is any demand, we maybe try to re-add these functionality, but so far no one has complained. So I assume it's just dead. So this is the configuration. In the past, you did this with an XML configuration. You can still use the XML config, but it's, as said, more modern to use to just import a configuration bean instead of adding an XML file. But both will still work. And I'm adding component scanning here, go through my beans. Let's just run this. So I have the run config. Yeah, it's just calling Maven Jetty run as I often use a plugin to run Jetty from a Maven project directly. It's especially useful if you have a WAR file. It will just run it. Yeah. In Spring Boot, we see a different way of running it. In ZK in a WAR file, we still need a Jetty or Tomcat to run the WAR file. Yeah, and now we added this one. Just go to my browser, go to localhost 8000, and then we see the application is running. Maybe disable this one for now. Can't remove it. Okay, doesn't matter. So it starts our application. And where I want to start is first with the core features, not with the security features. So I have a few pages here that just use some default features of ZK Spring without the ZK Spring security. For example, I'm using the simple Spring bean and just output a value from a service method. If we look into this service class, we have a simple bean. Now it's just a class. It has a message, get message function, and this get message function is just called from a Zool file. So in our core functions, we have the EL expression example. And that's what I mentioned. We have the delegating variable resolver. So we tell it to expose the Spring context, or the beans by name of the current Spring context, and make them available as just implicit or global variables in expressions. And yeah, dot message just means call get message, and then we get our value of the bean. So it could be any kind of POJO that's configured by Spring and returns some values you want to use here, where you want to leverage Spring configuration, or don't use this one. Always use. Don't use these old things anymore. Okay, and what else can we say? So this is the simplest example. Now just extending the expression language by Spring beans. And the same thing happens with data binding. Is this the bind composer? You can use this in many places and then refer to Spring beans by name. Here we have a view model. No, we don't have. I don't use a view model. I just use the bind composer directly, just to show that these things also work in data binding expressions. And the person is a bean that comes from. Where does the person come from? Did anyone notice? Application config, person. Here, person. Okay, the person is my desktop scope bean. Yep, because it's maybe some information about the current user that you just store for the current browser tab. And this will be a different value on, or this will be a different bean on every desktop, because it's created inside the desktop scope. Okay, then we have the Z script. Also, when using the delegating variable resolver, you can use this. You can use the Spring beans from the Z script. Again, the warning, don't use this in production. It's good for prototyping. It helps to just expose them for your test cases, for example, if you need something quick without writing extra Java code. And then we have the utility, the Spring util, which just has a get bean function to get a bean by name. Spring message get bean. So I don't need to show this yet. Just outputs the same label. Then custom scopes main and custom scopes window. This one is a small example showing how the custom scopes work. For example, here we have a controller, which is we have a Spring, no, a ZK controller, which is also a Spring bean at the same time. Possible to do this, and just see where is our scopes control one. It should be here. Yeah. So we give this a name. It's scope per desktop. So it will create this controller only once per desktop. And then we can use it like a normal selector composer. And we can use both. We can use auto wiring by Spring, so inject a Spring bean, and we can use wiring from ZK to inject components from the Zool page. So this one is like a monster, how to say, monster class. Yeah, it does both things for ZK and for a Spring injection. Yes. If we run this one, if we just go to the browser and go to the custom scopes main. Now what we see here is I can set a text message, set it, and then show the message directly in one in a pop-up window. Or what I also show here is I open another Zool page that that contains a pop-up or a modal window, which will then share the same scope, showing that the bean is available throughout the whole desktop. So we have the main window, and we have the main page and the window, which will use the same kind of message bean. Where was the message bean? The message bean was configured, simple message bean. Yeah, here. I assume you all know Spring, and Spring has many ways of configuring components. In this case, I just have a Pojo class and add the annotation and add the configuration in my via configuration class. So this bean is created from configuration directly, and the other bean, the simple message bean, is created automatically via the component scanning. Yeah, you see it's below app, and it's in app beans, so it will find this annotation here and also create the bean. So all the methods of creating and configuring beans in Spring are not affected by ZK. Spring does its job well, also inside a ZK application. Okay, I need to speed up slightly. Are there any questions about these scopes? Because there's not much else to say. You can use these custom scopes, and they live for different times. So it's not like a session. It's not like a session scope bean that lives through different requests. It just exists for the duration of a single page. Okay, then we can go into the Spring security just to show a few examples about what this does. Or first the demo. Run the demo. So this is the core. You see in the core package and in the root we have the Spring security. So what we see here is the index page. The index.zool, I'll just close all the others. The index.zool is here. Index.zool also uses the delegating variable resolver. So the same variable resolver is also available for ZK Spring security. And what we can do, for example, here in this, this is not not even using it. What we do is we use the execution and output the current username. If it's there, we have a few links to go to different pages which are either secure or extremely secure, or just demonstrating different levels. Yeah. So for example, if I go to the account list, this one should be available to everyone. So I can see I'm currently anonymous. My role is anonymous. I can see everything. But if I want to access one of these actions here, it will just fail because my permission has been denied. And that's what we saw in the ZK XML. It's kept catching this exception here, the access denied exception, and showing the error dialog. Maybe we should look at the Spring security configuration first. So what we have is the security configuration, which just shows a few default, how to say, Spring security config mechanisms. We have all these annotations to enable Spring security, secure enable, pre, post enable. I don't even know what these mean. They're mostly copied from the ZK examples. And what we need to do in ZK is disable the cross-site request forgery mechanism, because it will block AJAX requests from ZK. And we haven't patched we haven't changed the mechanism to fit Springs. Instead, ZK has its own mechanism to make or to ignore requests that come from a different source. Because ZK, every desktop has a unique ID or has a different ID, which is kind of our security, not security token, it's kind of identifier, so that no one can forge a request who doesn't know the desktop ID. And there is a whole article about it in our documentation. We will see the link in a later example. And then we have some frame options if we need frames. I don't know. It's just default Spring security. I forgot why we have this one here, this demo. More important is we have our folder mappings. We say only supervisors can see the secure extreme subfolder, and users can see everything that is secured, and everyone else can see anything else is not protected right now. We have a login URL, so also default ZK Spring login. I would suggest don't implement login yourself. Use some kind of single sign-on server or system, which is often available in larger companies. Then you can't get this wrong and just protect everything. Just protect your whole page, just star, so everything is unprotected instead. But we need to show some of the features here, so we made this a bit more detailed than maybe necessary in real life. And then we have our success handler, which is configured here, so we redirect somewhere. Also plain Spring security, not always easy. I don't say Spring security is easy, but it's all default configuration. And then logout success, go to the index.zul again and invalidate the session on logout. What else do we have? Some dummy user configuration. Also, don't use this in production. This is just hard-coded username passwords in memory, so that we don't have to configure a database or something, or an Active Directory for usernames and passwords. But this would be taken care of a single sign-on solution. And then we also have an ACL service to simulate some access control lists. Now here we just say which user has what kind of permission on a specific object. So ACLs are quite complicated, and are not often used from what I've seen, but I assume there are many cases where they are useful, but I've never used them in real life. Here just an example to have something to show what kind of functions we have from a ZK perspective. Okay, so this is the configuration. I found it always a bit nicer in XML, but okay, Java config works the same way. So we have our index.zool, nothing special here. We have the login.zool, where we just have a native form, and we post the form to our where is it, action, just to the login path, and then Spring Security will pick up and initialize the session based on username and password provided. And then we have, just log in. I'll just go back to home. And if you go to the secure page, it will redirect us to the login page. That's the wrong name. To just use one of the predefined, for example, Rod Koala, and log in. And what we can see now is you are a supervisor. You can therefore see the extremely secure page. So if we go here, we can also see the content, and it shows you're a supervisor. And it also mentions which kind of tag-lib functions are used to evaluate something on this page. And we have principal username ROD. So here again, it's using the authentication object that was introduced by the Spring Security. Wait, the stuff I mentioned. Where's my README? Here. It's added by this variable resolver. So we can use the authentication variable to get certain information of the current user. Just get the name directly, or go to the principal object, which can be multiple types depending on your server or your login scheme or the login mechanism. This can be almost anything. And then we see it's enabled, not locked, just some meta information provided by default security mechanisms. We can check our ACLs and see what kind of information what kind of permissions I have on the person with the ID 1. That's the information we set up in the ACL, in memory ACL configuration. And we can log out and go out. And now we are no longer logged in, so my username is nothing. And if I try to go somewhere else, it will fail again. So I need to log in maybe as an accountant, as a teller, just DN EMU. And now I can go to the, don't save my passwords. I can go to the account list and I can change the values. It no longer fails. So how are these checks performed? Just go through a few of these secure pages. Okay. One check we've already seen, that some paths are protected by role from our Spring config. So that's how we can avoid going to specific URLs. But this doesn't mean that that if you can go to URL, you can still do performance checks using the API and the utils provided by ZK. So if we go to the secure page, we have, what do we have? Somewhere we have the list. Does someone see the, no, the account list is account list. Okay, the account list is configured here. So this one will go to accounts, list accounts. It will go into Zool. So here I just use another feature of Spring MVC to configure a specific, how is it called, route now, or a specific path that goes to another page. So I just say, if someone goes to list accounts HTML, it should return list accounts as a view name, and then the view name is resolved in the view resolver as webinf_zool, so some internal file. So it's not available to the outside at all. So webinf_zool list accounts. So it's going here, and here we have these buttons, and these buttons trigger MVVM commands in our Big Bang view model. And inside these methods, I will just call a service to read the account and to set a balance. So you don't see any security checks here. It will just go inside the service and use the method security provided by Spring. And these exceptions will then will then be thrown out into our view model. We could either catch them, or what we did, we have a global error config to just display something if something fails. So my recommendation, use Spring Security as much as you can, and don't put a lot of code into the ZK application, because you can do this at your service layer anyway. And if someone replaces the UI, it's easy to forget a security check that was maybe added to a command handler. Yeah, don't put the security checks here unless you really have to. It's better to do this at service level, then the service is protected by itself and it doesn't depend on the UI around it. So this one is, even though I don't do any security checks, it will transparently be handled by Spring. Again, a Spring feature, not a ZK feature. If this succeeds, I just output the new value. Yeah, so if we go back, list accounts, what else can we see here? For example, we use one of the taglib functions. So we have this taglib URL which is called ZK Spring security, and I just assign it the prefix sec, which allows me to call these taglib function. For example, check if non-granted, to check if the user is not teller and not supervisor, then it will show, yeah, you can try, but you won't be able to change something. Otherwise, if the permission is granted, you can, it displays another label. So this one is not really to protect something, it is more to show or hide information, so that you can have a dynamic UI, the UI based on the current permission level of the user. But the actual security checks are done at service level. So ZK can access this information to output some user information. You could use this in to enable or make a button invisible or something, but that's something I never recommend, because if a button is just invisible, you can still make it visible via JavaScript and call it, because it exists at server side, and then there's a listener that does something. So again, the recommendation, put your security at the service level, then it can't get wrong in the UI. Okay, this is quite complicated to talk about right today. What else do we see? Login redirect URL. I somehow lost my, just go back to my README file, training notes. Okay, what would I, yes. So we have the taglib functions, both for roles and ACLs. An ACL check can be done, for example, here. Using the ACL function is accessible, and it requires, like the role checks only require one parameter to specify which roles are available or not, if you have all or none of these roles. And for accessible, you always need two parameters, which is the access level and the object you want to test access from. And then the implementation is completely up to you, how you implement your ACL, where the data is coming from. That is completely irrelevant to ZK. It just provides this convenience function to check the accessibility. And here you see I add this label only if I have this layer, if I have this level of access to this component. But the security check itself will be done by Spring in the end, and not in your UI. Yeah, okay. I wonder, it's quite quiet in the chat. I hope this is not too much, too dense information. It feels a bit unorganized to me today. So if there's things unclear, let me know. I know this is a lot. But Spring Security is complicated by itself, and ZK tries to just add a simple layer around it and make use of the existing functions as much as possible. And that's what this project is hopefully showing, that there is not a lot from ZK Spring Security, and the major work is lifted by Spring itself. It just shouldn't disable some of the functions. And the last feature that's important from this one is the The security context aware execution listener, as mentioned, it will make the security context available to WebSockets or server push threads. What it does, or what it looks like, just maybe just open the class, maybe easier. Control Shift, Control N, open this class. Now we just go into this. So it is a standard ZK listener for execution in it and cleanup. So it will always call before an execution is initialized and after it's closed. So at the beginning of a request and at the end of a request, or at the beginning of your activation during server push and at the deactivation of your server push UI change. It does not add anything to your own threads. If you want to add user threads that are not activated by ZK, ZK can't help you because anyone can add any kind of threads, and that's where Spring has this configuration, has an API to do this. And that's why I'm showing this code. Now we have this security context holder, which is a quite simple API. You either set a context or you clear a context, or you create an empty context. Now, so what it's doing is when initializing a ZK execution, it will just check, is there already an existing security context for normal web requests that go through the filter chain of Spring Security? It will already find the context, so it does nothing. Or if there's none, it will try to get the current context from the session. Load security context. And load security context is this method which checks the current session and asks for the Spring Security context attribute. And I think this is default Spring, right? Forgot. I think this is exposed by Spring directly. So if you want the current security context from the session, you can get it. The only thing you need to know is the session, and the session is already added by ZK. So whenever you have an active execution, ZK knows about the current session, and then this one just makes the current Spring Security information available during this current request. I think it's setting a thread local to make this available to all the magic functions that, or to make it available magically whenever Spring is evaluating your annotations on your service level. And this one is also added by default when you add the ZK Spring Security package. So in the web app init, it will just register this listener. But you can choose to disable it. Yeah, that's weird. Where's the value of this one? Spring. That's just a variable. So you can here. So that's the library property you can set or not set to disable this. But by default, it's just enabled. And yeah, so let's wrap this. Again, no, not enough time. So what I wanted to talk about is also the so I think, yeah, I want to talk about Spring Boot a bit. It's a quite large topic. Let's see. So we have Spring Core, Spring Security. So these are the configuration layer to enable or to expose general Spring features inside ZK. And then ZK Springboot is, could you show as function as ZKCE, PE, or EE? ZK Spring, I don't know what license is this included in? I mean, zkplus is available for CE version, so you can use Spring in every ZK application. The Spring Boot license, the Spring Security and the Spring license, I don't know if it was EE or PE.
Yes, they are EE.
Okay, they're EE. Okay, so I'm not fully prepared about this. Okay, so technically these are added by, okay, these two are added by EE then, and this one is the variable resolver and the Spring util are available for every license level. And also ZK Springboot is available at CE level. And as mentioned, you can combine these on demand. You can add Spring Core, Spring Security on demand inside a Spring Boot application. Okay, I think we are running out of time. I think we already had a session about Spring Boot, but I think we need to repeat this. So what I can say right now is, and I won't go into details right now too much, is ZK Spring Boot is not the modern Spring. ZK Spring Boot is more an alternative around using a Tomcat or a Jetty or a Glassfish, and instead use the deployment model to for example, build a jar file that's runnable by itself. And you can use the same Spring configuration, XML based or Java config, as in a normal Spring application. It just has more defaults and more conventions about what can be added automatically. It has all these autoconfig modules. And for this purpose, we have the Springboot Starter. As said, it's a starter. It's for getting started. Yeah. I need to say this somehow because often the users I talk to think this is the only way of adding ZK Spring Boot. And then the predefined versions maybe don't match what they want. So the Spring Boot Starter doesn't contain any code. It only contains it also doesn't contain configuration. It just contains dependencies. And that's the only thing about the starter. Yeah, it makes it easier to add the dependencies, but later in a project lifecycle, you will often find you need a different version of Spring, or you want an updated version of Spring, and then the pre-configured version in the starter is not useful to you. So just remove the starter and use the autoconfig directly, and then you can pick your own version. Because the autoconfig project, this one contains all the, as said, the automatic configuration modules, which work since I think Spring 4. You can use this on different Spring versions. But by default, we have the latest the latest Spring Boot version, I think 2.3. I just updated last week. But it also has versions for older Spring Boot dependencies. And what do we have similar? Yeah, and Spring Boot is again some kind of replacement of a web XML. Just configuring all the servlets and your filters and whatever, and your whole ZK application with Java config most prominently. And the autoconfig provides already some defaults for the update servlet, which is the Ajax servlet in ZK. For the layout servlet, if you have a WAR only deployment, to have ZUL file directories in the web application folder, which doesn't exist in a jar file deployment. So you can only use the update servlet, which can do both. It can do ZUL files and Ajax. And this one is optional for WAR files. It can contain richlet configuration, commit and WebSocket configuration, and it has a default view resolver. And it supports testing Z, so it has some Z supporting configuration. I think we don't have enough. I can only show what it does and how it works. Then we are running, and then we have some time for questions. So a Spring Boot, I just go to the minimal jar file. A Spring Boot application in ZK needs a single dependencies. If we use the starter, we just say use the starter, and it will do the rest for us. It will add all the dependencies we need. The minimal jar has dependencies for ZK bind and ZUL, so it uses just the available CE packages. It doesn't need ZK Max, but you can do it. And if ZK Max is available, the automatic configuration will detect that zkMax is available and enable WebSockets and commit servlet by default. So there's lots of hidden magic going on that you don't have to know about when getting started, but which you should know about it when you go into details, when you try to change something. So it's not preventing you from having to learn the basics. It's just I don't know, making the default configuration happen automatically that you in most cases use, but you can still change everything. So just to demonstrate this quickly, what it does is you can run this project also via Maven, Maven clean package, which will generate the jar file. And I think that's an often asked question, how to deploy a ZK in some kind of containers. And that's where the jar file deployment is very helpful. It's a single file. So if we just check our target folder, what we get is a single jar file. And if we unzip this jar file, it contains other jars. So it's like an, I think they call it Uberjar, Uberjar. I don't know how the English people pronounce the German word Uber. So I say Uberjar. And then you run it just with Java. Java minus jar and target ZK Springboot jar. And if I'm not running any other server right now, it will start up the current Spring in the latest version. And after a few seconds, the application is running and should output some kind of hello. Yeah, what's your name? Blah, blah, ZK application. So it's a single jar file that contains the whole application server, the ZK dependencies, and the Spring configuration and the Spring jar files all in one package. Well, it's one of the benefits of Spring Boot that makes these kind of deployments easier. You don't have to tell anyone where to or how to copy a WAR file into a Tomcat subfolder, webinf, something, web applications. It's just something that you can basically double click at with your mouse, and it will start a Spring Boot server. Yeah, there are lots of options. In the minimal configuration, of course, you don't need any options. I just configure a homepage. This is one of the options. And then it will find this minimal tool file. And in Java, in the Java code, there is just one application file that says I'm a Spring Boot application and my configuration is myself, just to have it runnable as a main class. So it just refers to itself to run itself as a main class or available via component scanning. So it can't be simpler than just 1, 2, 3 files is the whole application and a POM file to add one dependency. Yeah, I think we just go into the documentation folder directly. ZK Springboot. Here. So that you're not lost. The parameters are all mentioned here. So when which application properties are available, and then in the typical Spring Boot fashion, you can change these things. And you can mix and match. You can use Spring Boot in combination with the ZK Spring and the ZK Spring security jar file. It's all commented out here because I don't have time anymore to go into it. Where you can use the ZK Spring security on top of Spring Boot. So these things don't exclude each other. They are not better or worse. They just show different layers on top of either ZK or Spring. And Spring Boot is, as I said, a replacement, in my opinion, a replacement for Tomcat and the web XML configuration. Okay, I hope, yeah. And then there's support for ZETS testing. All in these demos, there are also test cases that are runnable. For example, here we have a web, a test object, the secure page test, which will run a test. It will connect with login, without login. So there are lots. Of course, it will connect with login, and there are lots of not lots, a few examples that show how ZETS can be used in combination with Spring Boot. I had another question already provided by email previously. So if there are questions, let them come in now. The one question I had was about Hibernate, or not Hibernate, about ORM, which kind of object relational mapping layer is preferred in ZK, and I can only say nothing is preferred. It is completely transparent to ZK which database is behind ZK. We can only repeat this as often as possible. Just use the one that's useful for you. In practice, I've most often seen Hibernate as an object relational mapping layer. With all its problems and quirks. So Hibernate is not perfect, but it's a mapping layer, and mapping is not always easy. What I prefer myself is sometimes Spring Data in combination with just JDBC. If you have some simple data structures or some simple database, Spring Data has lots of automatic DAO configuration or DAO generation. So you don't have to repeat all your queries. Okay. Yes, you're not. Okay. Then the other question is the code for the project available on GitHub? The code I have here is both available on GitHub. I will add the links in the chat, in the recorded chat. If you're asking for the recording, you will get the chat. Otherwise, the one code I've just, the one example, the one page, the one GitHub repository is ZK Springboot, which contains the same demos we've just seen here. Yeah, there's the minimal jar, minimal var security demo. And if you go to, instead of Spring Boot, you just go to ZK Spring, you also have the other demo. Spring Core, Spring Security source code, and the Spring Essentials, Spring Core Sec, which is for Spring Core and for Spring Core Security, the source code. So this is all available here. I think I need to update this slightly because it's still based on Java 5, so it will not compile on Java 11 because the compile level is deprecated. That's something to update. But it already works. So we also provide the source code of this project here with the download link later, so that you can also see the updated version earlier before we get to updating our examples on GitHub. Did I miss any question? Someone says he has to leave, then bye-bye, see you next time. But I'm still here. Jean, did I miss any question we had before?
I don't think so.
Okay, nothing. So I'm still here for a few minutes. I can only invite you to play with these examples. So for example, there's one project that shows how to build a WAR file. Sometimes you still need a WAR file. So Spring Boot has both deployment modes, a jar file and a WAR file. But then you lose some of the benefits of the jar file, obviously, but it's possible. Yeah, there's the security integration demo, which shows how to configure parts of ZK inside Spring Boot. It's a bit redundant to the Spring Core security demo because both are using Spring. And many Spring features just need to be configured independent of which ZK package is used. Even for a normal JSP application, you need to configure your security. So that's just examples that ZK is not ZK, that Spring and Spring Security are fully available. You just need to pick the features you want. and read the documentation of Spring Security. That's a beast. We can't copy this into ZK. So you need to know exactly what this is doing before using it. Our integration doesn't make Spring Security easier to use. It just exposes, as said, a few features. All right, then I would say okay, there's another one. Another question. With the Spring Boot app, can I join some Java modules in one? I don't understand what this really means, because Java module, I'm not talking about Java modules right now. Are you saying Maven modules? Or because it will collect all the Maven dependencies and put them all into the Spring Boot jar file. That's what I meant with the Uber jar. Maybe just unzip it for fun. If we go into, because we built this project once, we can just go show in files. Just go to this target folder, the minimal jar, and there we have the target folder, and here we have this jar file. And maybe this gets clear, huh? If we just extract this whole thing, we have something that Spring Boot created. There's a boot inf, a meta inf, and the meta inf contains stuff, boot inf. Here are the libraries. So there are all the jar files. So it has many dependencies put into one jar files. Some different apps I code. I think the purpose is to have them in isolation. So you can start and stop applications independent of each other. So you don't have to deploy them all into the same Tomcat. And otherwise, just go to the Spring Boot documentation. I think they mentioned something about multi-application jar files. I don't know exactly. I haven't seen this in real life. Huh? And if it's possible in Spring Boot, ZK shouldn't be the problem. If there is, let us know. Yeah, maybe we need to fix something for this. But it looks like it's designed to have one application for inside a jar file and not multiples. Okay, cool. Then we are out of time. I will stop the recording now. You can still write in the chat if you have something to say, or you have a question that you forgot.